Good evening and welcome to the Frontline Club. It's with great pleasure that we can welcome Patrick Symmes here tonight. Patrick was born in just outside Washington, D.C. and has been resident in New York for more than a decade now. He began his career as a newspaper reporter, rapidly moved on to write for magazines, and he writes and
as rapidly as possible
for magazines such as Harper's, Outside Magazine, and then he published a book called Chasing Che, which was a recreational following the Motorcycle Diaries of Che Guevara. And this week, his new book, The Boys from Dolores, comes out, or is out, and in fact there will be copies later. And I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm actually going to ask Patrick to say something about the book, what the premise was, and, once the alarm finishes outside, how you came to write it.
Okay. The premise of the book is that I stumbled on a photograph which is printed on the cover of the book and inside as well, and it shows 238 boys at an elite Jesuit college in eastern Cuba in 1941. I did pass out a few copies, so if you're curious, you can see them. And of course, the hook, the excuse here is, I think you know who one of those boys is, and he's marked on there in the lower right with his right shoulder against a white flag, Fidel Castro Ruz. And the idea I had is when I saw that photo for the first time, I'd already been working in Cuba for many years, and I was just kind of confounded by Cuba, which is a place, it's like a chimera. It's very difficult to get a fix on what Cuba is. And to me, that photo was like instantly like a Rosetta Stone. I wanted to decode it. I thought that the stories in that photo would explain everything in Cuba to me, because those boys were like a scientific experiment, almost like a control group who had been through everything that Cuba had gone through in the period leading up to the revolution. They showed where it came from and where it ended up. What happened to them is what happened to the revolution. And 5 years later, here I am.
One thing, just to go on about the book is to some extent a history of Cuba, seen through the members of the school. But it's also your experiences of working in Cuba, which I have to say, as ever, if anybody has worked in Cuba, have this mix of being very frustrating, very amusing, and ultimately rewarding. But also, and I think the book's particularly interesting because of its balance on this, when you follow a lot of the pupils who have obviously gone into exile and go to Miami, Spain, the Dominican Republic. Would you like to say a little bit about who you follow, how, and also, Patrick, a little bit about how people received that first phone call about you to speak about Fidel?
You've worked in Cuba, and it's one of the most sort of brilliantly disorganized countries in the world. It's deeply chaotic. And I was looking at that photo, and the fellow who showed it to me had become a professor in the United States named Lundy Aguilar, a professor at Georgetown University. And I would say, as I said to everyone subsequently, what happened to all these boys? And there was one, he said, well, there's a guy, he's living a couple of blocks from here. Go see him. You drive down the Searching Street, look for these two palm trees that are crossed like that, and you'll find him in that house. And I did. And that's pretty much how it all went. It tended to be person to person because it was a social network. They knew each other from 50, 60 years before, and they had a few ties still in place. The big question for me was, are any of them still in Cuba? Because the vast majority had gone into exile. It was a privileged environment, an elite school, families of the wealthy, and so on. And so my sort of real question is, in order to do a book, I had to find if some were still in Cuba. And one of the reasons I love Cuba so much is I was racking my brain, how do I find people? And I made the mistake of actually asking for help and trying to get, the press people in Cuba to help me or whatever. It's a complete waste of time. And I finally just said, screw that. And I got the 1954 alumni guide to the Colegio de Dolores, which listed the names and addresses of these boys. And I hired a taxi and went to the houses listed. And indeed, it's Cuba. Nobody ever moves anywhere. There's, you know, you knock on the door, and the guy answers. He's been in the same house since 1941. And they say, yeah, come and sit down. Fidel used to sit in this chair back when we were on the basketball team together. And they don't go anywhere. They're, you know, very few people in Cuba have moved out of the places they lived in 60 years ago. If you have a house, you keep it. And so the easiest way to find people was just to come back to where they had always been. And that's why Cuba is such a time machine to me. There has, you know, no place that combines this sort of futuristic rhetoric and ideas about the transformation of the world and the revolutionary society, yet is a completely static society as well at the same time. And remind me of the second part of your question.
Was how you were received when you made the phone call, and also I think, especially being an American citizen, perhaps in Cuba.
You know, it's funny. The response when I approached people was the same in the United States as in Cuba, which was suspicion. And I described some of the first calls I made to people. There's a guy named Jose Antonio Cobeñas who had a fist fight with Fidel when they were maybe 14 or 15, and he lives in New York City now, and I called him up, and he's completely convinced I was an enemy agent of some kind, and very suspicious, wouldn't talk to me, you know, hung up on me a few times, and I had to sort of go through friends and make contact, and it was pretty much a similar response in Cuba. I'd go back to Santiago de Cuba, this school, like all these boys, and Fidel himself. They're all Easterners from the second city of Cuba, and when I would make contact with these guys through the old alumni guide, they were quite suspicious and often refused to see me, and as a journalist knows, often the way to get past that is to simply keep them on the phone for a little while longer, or come back around a second time or a third time. There was one case, a fellow in Havana named Kiki de Young, and there were 3 de Young brothers in the photo, and 2 of them are in Miami, and 1 of them was in Havana, and this guy was the only really sort of eloquent defender of the revolution, who to this day remains loyal to Fidel and the revolution out of that group. And I called him up, and he refused to speak to me completely. He said, oh, you have to go through channels, you have to arrange interviews. And I sort of kept him on the phone for a while. And then I said, well, okay, I understand. You can't talk to me. You absolutely can't talk to me. That's fine. I understand. But could I just give you a book that I wrote, this book about Che Guevara? And he said, oh, okay. So one thing led to another. I'm going to drop the book off, and that turned into our first interview. And he was very suspicious, and he said to me, you know, you Americans, you're always trying to make a big thing, make a little thing stand for a big thing. It's like Time magazine. And I never quite got past his distrust. He did end up seeing, you know, we had 2 interviews, but he I think correctly sensed that to talk about these old times and these origins, he refused to speak one word to me about Fidel Castro himself in those days. He would discuss the intellectual justifications for a revolutionary society, but he wisely would not touch that subject of the personality involved.
Well, let's touch that subject now. Could you say something about, for the benefit of people who haven't read the book, a little bit about the school, who ran it, who it was for, and what it helped you discover about the mindset of Fidel Castro, and perhaps the role of religion in part in Cuba?
Well, the school was a Jesuit academy, one of 3 in Cuba, and I didn't know much about the Jesuits myself, one of the surprises, this book is also coming out in the States, and my English editor said to me, you know, you can cut this section about the Jesuits because everybody knows who the Jesuits are. And my American editor said to me, you need to expand this section on the Jesuits because nobody knows who the Jesuits are. You know, the Jesuit way of education is rigor and discipline. For a group that their alleged reputation is sometimes arch-conservative, anti-Enlightenment, but in fact they're a product of the Enlightenment more than a refutation of it, and they really believed in sciences and in you know, the wonderful school, beautifully equipped, and it drew in the sons of the elite, so that these boys in that photo are not exactly average Cubans at all. They tended to be either the elite and the wealthy or middle-class striving families. The one thing you see is that overwhelmingly they became professionals. They became engineers, doctors, accountants, lawyers, dentists. And that was really what the school was designed to produce, or even more so what they openly referred to as a vanguard. That was the purpose of the Jesuits, to create a vanguard to lead the world. They didn't have exactly this vanguard in mind, because of course 2 of the boys from Dolores did go on to lead Cuba in a different vanguard. They included a lot of famous names, Bacardi, which may ring a bell. There were 4 Bacardi boys at the school, and although it doesn't quite hold the same resonance for the English as it does for Americans, Ricardo was a boy from Dolores, the on-screen husband of Lucille Ball in I Love Lucy. And I read his absolutely filthy memoir. His real name is Dezzy Arnaz, or Dezzy Anchoa, something de Arnaz. And he came from this very important political family. His father was indeed the mayor of Santiago, and later the senator from Santiago, and a supporter of the dictatorship. And old Dezzy got chased out of Dolores by a mob, which burned his house down because there was a coup and the dictator was overthrown. And he said, let's go get Dezzy's family. And they burned his house down, and he ended up in Miami at 15 or 16 years old, singing for a living. And that's how he took up the guitar into making a living and becoming a band leader. And he invented the conga line in a desperate attempt to entertain Miami restaurant customers.
Not what the Jesuits must have had in mind.
No, although apparently he was a beautiful singer at the school, at the religious pageants, and was always singing on and playing his guitar, so he did learn it. He did learn it from the Jesuits. And what strikes me so much is the school is still today a school. I went back there, and I went back probably 4 times, and they were quite suspicious of me, but I bluffed my way in. And it has 3 times as many students today as it did in 1941. All of them wearing, instead of this uniform, the officer's cap and the neckties and the sort of formal military-style outfits that the Jesuits liked. It's the communist outfit, the red kerchief and pants, and they begin and end every day with these, chanted call and response, pledges of loyalty to the system and to Fidel Castro, and they finish out by chanting 3 times, "Seremos como el Che," we will be like Che. And I took a picture which is reproduced in the book of the school today, and it looks exactly the same, except you can just make out the slogans painted on the walls. And obviously the government has changed, and the school has changed. You asked about the effect of the education, and some of the boys from Dolores told me that there is a sort of eerie parallel inversion between the Jesuit model and the Communist Party model of thought. A vanguard, an elite chosen, a small elite chosen out for their talent and their ability to work hard, dedicated to this great cause, and particularly this Manichaean view of the world, absolute good, absolute evil. The Jesuits would have these religious retreats, and they'd say to them, there are 2 standards you have to choose, the standard of the army of God and the standard of the army of Satan. And if you die today, you will be confronted with that choice. Which side will you choose? And it echoes, the American politician Jerry Brown, who also went to Jesuit schools, said, and knows Castro, he said, it's really similar. He went to Jesuit schools. He said, the language is the same. The way everything is divided. Either you are for Cuba or you are against it. Either you're for the party in the vanguard or you are against it. And those Manichaean absolutes traveled with Fidel, I think.
One thing to say about the book and maybe to talk about is that the school, Dolores, is in Santiago, and Santiago is predominantly a black city, and it leads us to, and if you look at the picture, or if you come and see the picture, it is all white. I think there were 3 black students at some stage, maybe. And what's interesting is that Cuba itself now, one of the big differences, if one was to compare 1959 to now, is that something like the number, if you was going to look at it racially, it is now much blacker than it was, whereas Miami Cubans remain extremely white.
Yeah, Miami exile was originally a white exodus. Most of the boys from Dolores left in 1961, which was the great year that everyone decided to get out, the Bay of Pigs and so on, and that was a white flight. Exile has changed over time because Cubans of all colors leave now, ever since about 1980, but it is still defined if you look at the leadership of who it is. And Miami remains the last place in the United States where you can see parade goers go around in blackface during the Three Kings Parade in January. And the attitudes of most Cubans are more enlightened than that, but there is open racism, and indeed some Luis Posada Carillas, who's a notorious terrorist and hero to some exiles, has said among the list of crimes he cites against Castro is that he's blackened the country, literally. And it is true. It has changed completely or heavily, and not just racially, but even the language of between Miami and Havana is startlingly different. The exiles tend to speak this high Castilian, very educated, properly pronounced, deliberately old-fashioned Spanish, full of, they fetishize the old slang and use these old words, whereas you go to Miami, to Havana, or anywhere in Cuba, the Spanish is a kind of low Caribbean, guttural, drops its S's, doesn't finish the words, and is filled with all these comradely slang terms picked up in the Ukraine, or in Angola. You know, they talk about, there's a market in the street, they call it a candonga, which is an Angolan word that their soldiers picked up. And so that Cuba that the exiles remember literally does not exist anymore. It's only inside them, and they wouldn't recognize it if they went back, racially or otherwise.
Before we open it out to the audience, one of the fascinating chapters, I have to say it's really worth reading because you get into people's personal stories of when and why they decided to leave. And I think it gives a real insight into what happened. And perhaps to talk a little bit about some of the people who didn't leave in 59, didn't leave in 60, and then why the Bay of Pigs changes things, and that there is this flight in 61.
Well, I mean, it's important to remember the revolution, we were talking about this a little bit before, whatever its many, many, many flaws that you can catalog, had social justice goals explicit, some of them achieved. Some of them achieved right away. 1961 was the year of literacy, this great campaign to teach all the illiterates to read and go out in the mountains and teach the poor. And I think when Castro came to power, he had 90% approval, probably more. Probably 95% of Cubans supported the revolution. And all these guys who had known Castro said there's no way he was a communist at that time. He just wasn't. He had no ideology other than nationalism, patriotism, and his one greatest motivation in life, which has been to kick the United States out of Cuba, to be truly independent from America for the first time in Cuban history. And what happened in 1961 is a sobering sort of window on how psychology works, because the worst thing in the world is to have a victory. And the Bay of Pigs for Castro was a victory. And when you have that victory, it reinforces all your worst instincts. And it removed, he was secure in his position for the first time and had explicit evidence of the enemies around him. The United States had attacked him. The CIA was trying to kill him. The exiles were mercenaries working for him. So he had all the justification he needed. And his reaction to this event was to cast off all pretense, all the final pretense at any sort of shared power or even the idea of freedom of thought. And I talk in the book about his sort of first reaction was not political, it was cultural. His reaction to the Bay of Pigs was to summon all the intellectuals in Cuba to a great meeting in the National Library in Havana in July of 1961, and he gave this famous speech, which is still available in Cuban bookstores. And he said in that speech, he took his gun off and he put it on the table, which was either, some people interpret as he was submitting himself to the intellectuals, and others say, no, that was a warning. And in that speech he said, within the revolution everything is permitted, outside the revolution nothing is permitted. And he wasn't the first person to say that. Mussolini was apparently the first person to say that. But it created a dividing line in Cuban society. That from now on, loyalty was the test. And many people understood at the Bay of Pigs, or that summer when that happened, that there would no longer be tolerance of any difference or diversion, that the nature of the revolutionary project was absolute. And one after another, they told me that was it. Boom, we're out of here. And they sort of either heard that speech or understood that speech or saw what was happening after the Bay of Pigs, sort of some mass roundups and so on. And everyone, 100,000 people left in the 7 or 8 months after the Bay of Pigs, just a true exodus. And being the boys from Dolores and middle class or upper class, they left on airplanes, not on rafts. And with tickets and permission and so on. But it was the start of the exodus that made the Cuban exiles.
Could you describe a little bit, because I think it's very enlightening as to how people left in terms of what money they could take with them, what they could take with them. And there is this wonderful story about the boat with the new pesos that Castro was going to introduce. And I think it's worth... I think many people may think when people left in 1961, they left with all their money to set up a rich and wealthy lifestyle in Miami, but it wasn't quite like that.
They made very strict rules when you left, which are still in force today. When you leave Cuba, if you apply for a passport to leave Cuba, usually within 24 hours, the authorities arrive at your house and make an inventory of everything in the house, every book, every pair of socks, every possession. And it now belongs to the state because they say, well, the revolution made your life, the revolution gave you life, and so this is the property of the people. And there were very tight and increasingly tight restrictions. The number of socks you were allowed to be wearing, they would check. Was it just one pair? You couldn't wear 2 pair. Number of shirts, well, you can't wear 2 shirts. The watch bands were confiscated if they were gold. Jewelry, and there's a wonderful sort of depressing, terrifying scene in the novel by Carlos Ayer called Waiting for Snow in Havana, where he describes at, I think, the age of 12, being, as he was leaving with his family in 1961, being taken aside and the police looking in his underwear to make sure he had nothing hidden down beneath his cojones. And that was the most humiliating experience of his life, and he sort of never got over it. And he actually says in his book, "Thank you, Fidel, for teaching me, how it could go." People weren't allowed to leave with anything, but the boys from Dolores, there's quite a few stories. Cuban exiles always say, I left with nothing. I never had a penny, except that $10,000 I snuck out through my sister. And they tell these stories, and they were really excited about the different ways they'd fooled the system. The guy who was the dentist, who I described, who became a secret agent for Castro, Jose Antonio Roca, hollowed out the heels of shoes, filled them with the gold from his dental practice that he used for fillings, and then paid someone to walk across to Guantanamo Bay, which at that time was open and you could go across every day, and he'd give a new pair of shoes to someone every day, and he got a few $1,000s out there. I describe that fellow Kiki de Young, who stayed behind and was loyal, actually helped his brothers in an elaborate scheme to get some money out because they got word about this ship full of money, which arrived in the Santiago harbor in late '61, and there was this rumor in the harbor, there's a ship full of money, what's going on? And some people had seen the money and it had Che Guevara's signature on it, and boom, one day, David de Young, the oldest, wisely acted first and thought later, and he went to a jeweler, they're a very wealthy family, and he converted as much as he could into gold and hid it in the trash bin in their backyard, just dropped it into the ashes as about $25,000 worth of gold. Boom, stirred it in with a stick. And about a week later, the government announced that they had replaced the national currency, the old peso of the republic, which was valued at 1 to 1, with this new money. With Che Guevara's signature, and all pesos were invalid, and I think it just about $260 million disappeared overnight in terms of value. And this new money was installed, and it created complete chaos and was one of the major steps in destroying the Cuban economy. And the reason that story fascinates me is because money itself is the problem in Cuba. If people have money, they are out of control. They're independent. It's why prostitutes in Cuba are the most honest people in Cuba, because they make their money outside of the government, and they don't depend on jobs or have any loyalty to anyone other than themselves. And Cuba has consistently, sort of once a decade, they sort of detonate the economy and create a new currency, which is a way of seizing all money in circulation. You know, they closed all bank accounts, and they do it routinely. They did it in the early 90s, and they just did it again about 2 years ago and created a new, called the CUC, the Peso Convertible, which has suddenly made everything in Cuba very expensive and is killing their tourism for it. And it's a way of taking all money out of circulation and saying, well, everyone, you have to come to us because the old money is no good. You come to us, we'll decide how much it's worth, and you'll be allowed to have 50 pesos a month. And it's a way of controlling money, controlling finance, and ultimately preventing people from having money, because money itself seems to be the enemy of centralized government. The idea that people could be on their own is unconscionable.
What I'd like to do is take it out to the audience now. We've obviously done a very historic look, which is part of the book, and not gone contemporary. I'm rather hoping that some of your questions will bring us up to date, and we can talk about what's happening now and maybe the future. Yes. Len. Could you possibly make sure you put the microphone so we can hear it, and say who you are, please?
I'm Len Brown, an independent TV producer. I went to Cuba about 10 years ago for a week as a almost classic tourist, and was magnetized as Patrick has been. Patrick, the inevitable question, what do you think is going to happen when Fidel parts this earth?
Well, first of all, the inevitable disclaimer. Anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen in Cuba is lying. There are two people who know what's going to happen. I was there last week. I just got back. My overwhelming impression was of the stability of the system right now, which was a surprise to me, with Fidel quite ill, perhaps recovering, perhaps on the way to some sort of comeback. But however, that comeback has to be temporary. He may not be dying, but he's not exactly living either. And I expected to find instability, change in the wind, people thinking about new things. Just the opposite. The propaganda is more severe than ever. Every effort is being spent on convincing people nothing will ever change. And it's, I believe, a state of denial. Raul Castro is in power. He's a spry 77, I believe. And like his brother, I should point out, there are 6 Castro siblings, and all 6 of them are still alive. So this is a long-lived family. This could go for quite a while. And I came back from Cuba thinking that the most likely sort of short-term scenario is they're very adaptable. They've succeeded in, I first went to Cuba in 1991 because everyone told me, oh, you better go now. This is it. They're in their final days. And we were joking. There's a book. It's actually not a bad book by Andres Oppenheimer called Castro's Final Hour, which was published in 1991. And there's a lot of people who publish books like that, so you can see why I'm hesitant to make predictions. But they are adaptable. They survived the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. They survived the just desperate times in the early 90s. They made a switch to a tourism economy. I believe that in the short term they could keep the system going. It is a repressive system, but it is also driven by below from idealism, so there's some idealism left, despite all the terrible problems. My worry is in the long term, I do see a dark future. I think that so much energy has been stifled and people are full of frustration and pent up. Most Cubans only know the revolution. They've never known anything but this. And they are hungry for food, hungry for products, hungry for normal life, hungry for a venue to use their talents and energy and purpose in life. So that could play out well. This could be, a new birth of freedom, but when I look around the Caribbean, or I look at the past of Cuba, and I believe in continuity, I believe in this idea that, you can tell something about the future of Cuba by looking at the past. Cuba has had one free election in its history in 1942, which was a long time ago. No one remembers it. And the rest of the Caribbean is full of guns and cocaine. what's going to happen to Cuba when that social compact starts to fall apart and the monopoly of force that keeps things in place disappears? Vengeance. I was last week talking to a lot of dissidents and human rights people about Cuba, and some of them are optimistic, but quite a few of them are not. They think that there's a lot of frustration, and I describe in the book getting attacked by some kids in the street in Havana, and there's a lot of sort of ruthless people who right now are being held down in place, unable to do anything because they're living inside a system where there's 100,000 police officers and the slightest dissent is brutally suppressed. So one aspect of freedom is very, very messy, and I think that I am fearful for the future.
Hi, Ruth Sullivan, Financial Times. I just wondered how much you see Cuba opening up to foreign investment now in terms of tourism, maybe oil exploration, with chosen foreign partners, maybe Venezuela and others. What your view is on that? And a second question, if I may. What would the boys from Dolores be doing today professionally? When I was in Cuba a couple of years ago, most professionals I met were driving taxis because it paid a lot more than working in their professions for which they were trained.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first question about the role of foreigners and investment, the 1990s was a boom time for that, but I believe it's come to an end. In the last 2 years, they've been re-centralizing the economy and kicking out large numbers of foreign businessmen. It's a little bit like the currency issues we were discussing. If they could have their way, the leadership would get rid of every foreigner on the island. They don't want an opening. They're not interested in liberalization or reforms. Raul Castro is talking about the opposite. They've eliminated categories of self-employment, and there are exceptions. Oil is a good example because they desperately need it. I'm a cynic about this because every 5 years there's a grand announcement about new oil deposits found in Cuba, yet they never have any oil. They get oil from Venezuela now, subsidized, and it's saving them billions of dollars a year, and allowed, for the first time I've been to Cuba, there were no blackouts, which has a big effect on people, so the situation has improved thanks to Hugo Chavez. But a lot of foreign investors went into Cuba, Spanish companies, Argentine companies, Mexicans, Canadians, even the U.S. is now both directly and indirectly doing a lot of business with Cuba, and a lot of them got burned. A lot of people lost a lot of money because the Cubans threw up their hands and said, oops, we're broke. Sorry, we can't pay you back for all the hotels you built. And it's been bad business. Very few people have made money in Cuba, and ideologically they just don't like having capitalism on the island. They do it to survive. Tourism is the only business in Cuba now. And it is the leading source of retained earnings, the main source of money being Cuban exiles from abroad and Miami. Miami is the engine of the Cuban economy. But they would get rid of foreigners if they could. And please remind me again the second part.
Oh, what are the current boys on Dolores? Are they becoming taxi drivers and desperate?
Well, there's only a few who are still in Cuba, a small percentage, and they are retired. These are older people. Some of them were professors, for example, accountants, and so on. And I think for decades, the old joke in Cuba is that there's only one man who does any work, and it's Fidel, staying up till 5 in the morning memorizing his reports. And most jobs in Cuba, the economy is kind of they shuffle things in a circle, so lots of people who had jobs, you really don't do much work. You take your papers and put them over there, and somebody puts them over there, and then it comes back to you, and that's what being an accountant in Cuba is, socialist accounting or something. It's not a system that adds up to much. It's true now, the younger people, the generation that came after them, the students who graduate from that same school today, face this dilemma that a taxi driver earns far more than a doctor. That being a professional is rewarding in non-financial ways, but you end up earning $14 a month. And there was actually a wonderful play, an official authorized play in Havana about 5 or 6 years ago about two old high school friends who meet up 10 years later, and one of them's become, I think it was a doctor or some kind of important professional or an architect or something, and he's completely broke, and the other one washes the windshields of cars for foreigners in a parking lot, and he's got the money to go buy a can of beer, which is a high-status object in Cuba, an actual can of real beer. And the playwright was telling, it's so exciting to them because the key scene in the play is when the guy goes to get a can of beer because he's got $1, and then he opens the can and the whole theater goes dead silent because everyone's like waiting for that sound when the can opens, because it was such a status symbol. This is somewhat declined in Cuba because canned beer is more common now, but these simple objects that were the ultimate dream that you could have a can of beer. And that's, the Cubans are aware of this dilemma and talk about it all the time because, I went to Dolores, and I can't remember the exact number of students from there who applied to go to Cuban medical schools, but it's very high. Out of 700 students, a couple hundred had applied to go to medical school because it's considered one of the better Cuban schools. So there's no shortage of idealism, but nor is there a shortage of cynicism. Cubans refer to the doctors. They do all these international missions. They export doctors all over the world, and it's described as, they send them to Venezuela out of solidarity and so on. But that's not what Cubans refer to it as. They refer to it as going to get dollars, because when the doctors go abroad, they are paid by the foreign governments and can earn a small amount of money, but more than in Cuba. So even in the best case, these professionals, they have to deal on a day-to-day basis with trying to get enough money to survive. And but I was impressed with the fact that so many kids still wanted to go to medical school, even though they're going to end up as poor as somebody who's shoveling coal from one side of the harbor to the other.
Gentleman in front of David Sells, and then David afterwards.
Andy Hayward from your publishers. I identify with that last comment about taxi drivers, because taxi drivers earn more than we publishers. You're in a marvelous position, actually, to talk about the Fidel Che Guevara relationship. And I'm given to understand that in the early 1960s, there was a huge tension between the two of them because Fidel wanted basically a mono-commodity economy, and Che Guevara wanted diversification. When Che Guevara died, do you think that the spark in one way went out of the revolution, that in other words it was destined to go down a certain road?
Many Cubans believe that. One of the sort of experiences I had in Cuba the first time I was there in the early 90s, that we talked about a very desperate time, and I was talking to a fellow who, his father had gone off to East Germany to work, and the Berlin Wall fell, and East Germany ceased to exist, and the father refused to come home, and this guy was sitting there drinking beer all day on a bench, crying and saying, "I'll never see my father again. What am I going to do? I wish I could go join him." And he pulled out a picture of Che Guevara, and he said, if he were still alive, none of this would be happening. That's a hard proposition to rebut. If he were still alive, none of this would be happening. Well, what can you say? Maybe if Che Guevara were still alive, he'd be a gray old man standing on the podium next to Fidel. Maybe he would be, like so many others, in exile in Paris or Miami. Many of Che's closest aides and confidants, almost all of them, are in exile now. So they believe that some sort of spark went out, that he represented something else, the alternative, a sort of a larger vision, a humanitarian vision. He was always talking about the poor, the disenfranchised, the children with no food, infant mortality, and sort of was the best of the revolution in that sense. So that idealism maybe died with Che. It's impossible to separate out truth from speculation about their relationship. There's more conspiracy theories than answers. Did Fidel send Che off to die? I don't think so. I take a more sort of Shakespearean view, and I think that ambition and self-knowledge drove Che Guevara out of Cuba. He was unhappy being an administrator. He was running the central bank or the industrialization programs, which he himself said failed. And he wanted to go back to that purity of combat and revolution and overthrowing and be the internationalist. He went on one attempt after another in Africa and finally in Bolivia. And I think that they, inevitably there was some frictions between them about the future and the direction and the purpose of the revolution, but that the best evidence is that they were loyal to each other to the end. Some people say Castro made a huge mistake because when Che was fighting for his life in Bolivia in the final months he was alive, and he was sort of cut off, he'd lost his radio, they were running for their lives in the Bolivian jungle, chased around by CIA agents, and Castro sort of impulsively one night read Che's farewell letter over the radio, which was supposed to be read when he died. And he was still alive, but Castro hadn't heard from him in months. They had no communication. And it had a lot of details about what he was doing in Bolivia. And it's sort of people say, he was trying to kill Che. The CIA was listening to that. And I don't believe it was directly responsible, but they had come to some sort of separating of ways, and Che had truly left for good because he kept trying to leave, and he did in the end. He wasn't coming back. He was going to make the new revolution. And my Shakespearean analysis is that I think he really needed, like Castro, he was driven to find something bigger all the time. Castro never stayed in one school for long. He couldn't be contained within any institution. He started at one school, he transferred to a Catholic boarding school, then he transferred to Dolores for 5 years, and after he had this terrible fist fight with this guy, he said, I said, I'm going to, and he told his father, you have to send me to the sister school in Havana, it's more prestigious, it's bigger. And he couldn't be contained within institutions, and I think Che Guevara could not be contained within one country or Cuba. That who he was this ever-expanding vision. He said 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams, and it's tough to believe in that and then be content with running a failed rapid industrialization scheme.
Yeah, David Sells, formerly BBC. How much do you think is it the United States that has kept this little tin pot figure in power over the long years by treating him as though he was a vast Stalinist, and all the rest of it? And I just wonder whether if, again, over long years, they'd allowed money to flood in, been free with tourism and all the rest of it, it might have pulled the rug from under Castro.
Yeah, there is that argument, and quite a few sort of diehard loyal revolutionaries have told me if the embargo is lifted, we're done for. I don't know that that's true. They have a surprising ability to survive. We were discussing if you went to Cuba in the early 90s expecting to see the revolution fall, it's sobering to be here 15 years later or 14 years later. But it has to be true that the embargo has been counterproductive. The travel embargo, above all, isolation has allowed, every time a light bulb blows out in Matanzas, Castro says, you see what they do to us? And it plays right into his hands. It becomes the hostility of the United States is the last great rallying cry of Cuba, because his project, his life's work, was eliminating foreign influence in Cuba, this great national project that goes back to the war against the Spaniards, to have a truly independent Cuba. And United States hostility just proves his point. I was visiting with these dissidents in Cuba last week, and going around, I talked to probably the most important, named Osvaldo Payá, and across from his house there's a huge mural that shows him, Osvaldo Payá, invading Cuba with a U.S. Marine. And that sort of hostility just endlessly plays into and justifies the revolution and becomes the prop that holds up the sort of moral claim of the revolution to be defending Cuba against outsiders. And alas, every insane CIA attempt to poison his wetsuit and poison his milkshake and make his beard fall out and drop NASA rockets on his head, all of which they really did. These crazy, crazy schemes that they were churning out. It's all true. They really did it. They did try to kill him 60 times. And it all plays into his hands and is, all the justification he needs. That's what he talks about. That's what the system talks about. The United States is an imperial power trying to crush us, and Exhibit A is the trade embargo. And I have to point out, when George Bush and Fidel Castro used the exact same language to describe the embargo, you know something is going on. When Bush says, yeah, we're going to crack down on Castro. Warning sign, because actually what Bush has done is open up huge loopholes in the embargo. Things that Bill Clinton had done them, it would have been called a commie and put on the rack. George Bush has listened to the whisperings of farm state senators and the lobbyists from major American agribusiness corporations and created a loophole which has generated enormous trade between Cuba and the United States in food, agricultural products, the services related to agricultural products. And first it was 60 million, 150 million the next year, then 350 million, then it became 700 million, then $800 million a year in trade. If you eat chicken in Cuba, there's a very good chance you're eating chicken from Arkansas. The apples come from Washington. Last week I was in a Cuban store, frozen turkeys, certified USDA approved. And it's not all the food in Cuba, but it's a significant amount, and neither side wants to discuss this. And it's yet another paradox that this endless hostility is matched with a completely different reality, but that's Cuba. Hypocrisy is the name of the game.
Patrick, could I ask you, just taking that on a bit further, we've spoken about the future from a Cuban point of view. A lot of your book is also concerned with people who left and went to Miami. How do you find the Miami Cubans discussing the future and what is likely to happen moments after Castro's death? Were they being realistic about their plans? Has that changed? How do you see that?
I do think that a fire has gone out of the exile. There was for decades, they kept their bags packed, and there was the great exile dream is the house, the restoration. I'm going back to the house that I lost. And indeed, I saw President Bush give a speech in the Rose Garden, Cuban-American politicians all lined up behind him, and the representative from Miami, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Cuban-American, got up, and the first two words out of her mouth were, the house, the houses of our forefathers. And that is the classic dream of the exile, but too much time has passed. A second generation has come. The exiles had children. Now they have grandchildren who barely speak Spanish. And the younger generations never knew Cuba, and they tend to have a very distorted, unrealistic view of Cuba, but they also tend to have more moderate views, more interest in compromise. It's Miami. They're interested in business and doing tourism. So there's a lot of potential there for development. And of course, the boys from Dolores are not typical in that sense. They were Jesuit trained, very disciplined in their thinking, and they do not tend to be the caricatured exile, the screamers and the shouters. They're more nuanced. They can see many sides of an issue. And my sort of prophet in this book, Lundy Aguilar, the professor, told me, he said, well, maybe Cubans will go back over time. And he was a professor of European history, and he takes a rather long view, because I said to him, what do you mean over time? And he said, well, over centuries. And which is and they openly sort of court themselves, they see themselves as like the Jews on this historic exodus that is not now. They're not going home. Another fellow, Pepin Bo, said to me, many of them said to me, I always thought I would go home. I always thought I would go back, and now I know that's not true. Perhaps they're not the typical exiles in that way, but I think so much of that generation has passed. The armed militants used to go hopping around in the Florida Everglades, training to do something. They can't get over the logs anymore. And their children are not out of the same breed. So I think to some degree that scenario has faded away, and the classic nightmare that the day 2 minutes after Castro died, everybody's going to jump in their boats with a rifle and go down there and say, get out of my house, you. That's not going to happen, and it would be a disaster if someone attempted it, because that is the one thing that will push every button in Cuba. People told me just now, we're not giving up these houses. We've lived here for 40 years. We're not giving them up.
In fact, the US have in place, don't they, that on the announcement of Castro's death, all the ports will be closed to try and stop people
yes,
coming
the
out?
Coast Guard just had an exercise last week, actually, in preparation. They do every few years, and all the newspapers make up their mock headlines. Everyone's preparing. The Coast Guard, they're shutting all ports and tripling their patrols and giving up on the drug dealers so they can chase old Cuban men around the ocean. And I noticed that when I was in Havana, I happened to run into a couple of New York Times editors, and they confessed that they're not given any press visas. They can't get a correspondent in to save their life. So they've been hiring freelance writers who have the only qualification is you have to have no connection whatsoever to the New York Times. And you get paid to go to Cuba on vacation for 2 weeks, and they're just rotating them 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, so they have someone in Cuba, and they'll buy you a ticket, and all you have to do is never written for the New York Times, and you can be their man in Havana. And I sort of pity those guys, because there's a classic genre in journalism, which is waiting for Fidel, and I've seen reporters on that assignment. They get depressed. They're sitting in Havana. I was with the novelist Robert Stone, who got an assignment. Oh, yeah, I'm going to interview with Fidel coming up. It's all arranged. And I'd sort of go around every 3 or 4 days. How's it going, Bob? Oh, you can't leave the hotel because he could call at 4 o'clock in the morning. You can't go anywhere. You can't do anything. Sort of after a couple of weeks, I was sneaking him liquor in the hotel because I said, oh, God, yes, I'm going to go home now because it's just terrible. And that it's death by boredom to wait for Fidel. So these New York Times guys may be waiting a long time.
In fact, I have to say, no British journalist has ever had an interview with Fidel Castro. That is correct. The BBC has had, I know because I put it in 1992 I put a request in and have been on precisely that journey, and it's not so far happened. We live in hope.
Be patient, be patient.
With it. I'll open it back out into the audience in a minute, but just one other thing I thought was interesting with what you had to say about the anti-Americanism. It seems to me that Latin America has moved. The left has always been anti-American, but you've seen with what's happened since September the 11th and the response in Afghanistan and Iraq, a marked movement against the United States. And anybody who's been following George Bush's latest tour of Latin America, that was extremely apparent. And of course Chavez has taken the baton on from Fidel Castro. So it seems almost back to the, I would say the 70s, except the 70s was very much of the left that was anti-American. Is that going to be something that will be Cuba's legacy?
I'm not sure the current wave, either the leftist governments or this wave, which as you point out is not confined to the left, is credible in all sectors of Latin American society, of anti-Americanism, is really a Cuban legacy. There are many things outside of Cuba driving it. Economic changes, capitalism, neoliberalism, which are seen as vehicles for America to some degree. But it is true, Hugo Chavez, he refers to Fidel, he says, "How are you, father? Dear father, are you feeling better?" So it's very explicit that he plays the role of a symbolic role of a hero, and if he dies now, I think he'll get to write his own ending. He gets to go down as, yes, at this moment when Latin America was united across sectors in anti-Americanism or anti-certain policies, and there's a kind of a credible organizing principle at work in many countries now of resisting the imposition of economic agendas from abroad. And it is a resurgent moment. These leftists who are in power in Latin America now are from a very different breed from the 70s. The fire of revolution has been extinguished to violent revolution, and I don't see even Hugo Chavez, for example, doing what Fidel Castro did almost immediately, which was seizing every large property in his country. He does not touch private property. Even in Bolivia, Evo Morales, nationalized the natural gas companies and then gave the keys back to the Brazilians and said, "Okay, you can keep working here." So it's a different degree of what's going on. They live in perhaps a capitalist world of necessity. But symbolically, Fidel is in position right now. If he manages to die tomorrow, he'll have the most emotional funeral in Latin American history, and I think every president in Latin America will be there to cheer him on. But he's a tough fellow, and he may stick around long enough to blow this opportunity. The mood could change over 5 or 10 years. Cuba is not, in fact, much of an example of success in many sectors, so the reality doesn't hold up as well as the image. And I, as we talked before, I sort of fear for the future, and I think a decaying, slightly deranged Cuban state determined to hold on to power with force could be a dangerous and discrediting thing, and that it's not impossible that the revolution will discredit itself in a blaze of self-destruction in the end. There's a lot of sort of apocalyptic energy. They're kind of looking for a takedown. They're constantly predicting, the Marines are coming, they're coming, the Yankees are coming, and they actually wish we were, I guess.
Hello, I'm Mandy Chang, freelance producer-director. I just wondered, even if there is a smooth transition of power and socialism in Cuba, whether you think it can survive beyond that huge cult of personality that Fidel Castro is.
So if there is a transition, can a form of social
transition, whether it can survive not having that cult of personality that Fidel Castro has always represented.
Can socialism survive? Or Cuban socialism survive?
Can Cuba survive without that huge personality? Because Raul isn't really...
Cuba is bigger than one man. There's a future. It has to. I mean, of course, yeah, it will survive in some way. A smooth transition is possible. Many of the dissidents that I spoke to, they're cut from a different cloth from what you hear in Miami, where they're all, these guys were telling me in different parts of Cuba, we don't want the imposition of radical neoliberal economic policies. We don't want to give up universal socialist policies of healthcare and education. People are behind that in Cuba. They want those things. So if that's what they want, there's a good chance it'll survive in some form, as long as you don't let the geniuses and think tanks in Washington set up the new Cuban economy. A smooth transition, I have trouble seeing how it will happen. I look at elections. No one in Cuba has any knowledge of what a free election is. They don't believe in parties. They don't have parties. There are no two Cubans who agree on the future. I asked everybody. I went all over the island asking people, what's going to happen? I got a different answer every time. Different models. Oh, the China model. Oh, no, we're going to be like America. Oh, no, we're going to be like Europe. We're going to be like Switzerland. We're going to be, it's going to be like the old Cuban Republic. Nobody can agree. But that's because they haven't had a dialogue yet. And I'm actually hopeful. The ideal situation is for Fidel to go on like this, silent but alive, so that there's a lot of time to begin to think and deal and come to some understanding of the consequences of changes and have the dialogue that they are not having now. In order to have a smooth transition, a genuine transition, not a succession from Fidel to Raul, but a transition from one form of government to another, there has to be a give and take and a dialogue, whether it's in elections or it's discussions in the current parliament. That dissident I mentioned, Osvaldo Payá, made this request, gathered 25,000 signatures around Cuba for what was called the Varela Project to request reforms to government, new elections, 600 deputies to be elected openly from all sectors of society to have a dialogue about the future. It's a great plan, and he's hopeful that it will actually someday be put into place, but the current government said no, and they took the signatures and threw them in the trash. So it is possible, but you have to go through a lot of steps. You can't just go from here to there. And so far, no steps have occurred.
Can I be really cheeky and ask another question?
I think you can.
I was just wondering what the standard of education was in Cuba, and how much is education a form of propaganda and indoctrination?
That's a good question. The standard is high, and it's highly propagandistic. Technical education is superb. You find outside Havana giant polytechnic universities set up. Cubans are highly educated. You find all the time Cubans who speak Russian, German, Hungarian, and they all remember the good old days in the Warsaw Pact. The arts thrive and are heavily supported. Classical pianists are a dime a dozen on the streets of Havana. So it's unlike many Latin American countries in having a profile where the average person, virtually everybody graduates from high school, which is not the case in a Peru or a Bolivia. So people are very highly educated. But, to answer the second part of your system, every aspect of that system occurs within relentless propaganda. The school day at Dolores, today it's called the Manuel Cespedes something or other school, begins and ends with these personal pledges of loyalty to both Castro and Fidel. I saw a marching band last week, and the majorettes were 7 years old with their little batons, and they're twirling in their sparkly outfits, and they're so happy. And it was all very interesting, and the youth orchestra is playing out of tune, and this was in a small town called Remedios in central Cuba, and it's very nice, and I was sitting watching and taking some pictures, and then they finished their routines, and these, sort of 75 girls who are 7, 8 years old get down on one knee, hold their batons in the air, and start this chant, or this sort of memorized phrase, which just goes on and on. I was like, says, Dear comrade and an invincible marshal of the Republic, Fidel, we pledge our allegiance, and it goes on and on. I'm like, whoa, these little girls remember this. And you see the drum corps behind them was little boys, and there was this 5-year-old boy, just 5, trying to recite this, and he's stumbling over the word imperialism, and his mother is like, come on, imperialism, yeah. So at that age, they are started in with the, it's universal. It's not a question of opting out or some people having that. The propaganda is heavier than ever that I've seen in Cuba, which I think is because they are feeling something changing in the wind. And an education system that doesn't teach people to think critically has a serious flaw in it. But that said, you can get an MBA in Havana. There's 2 different programs to get an MBA. They have amazing science programs. They've produced wonderful doctors. It's a great system, except for its universal and enforced political content.
What?
Hi. I've been to Cuba a couple of times, and one thing I just can't quite figure out, which is how does the long arm of the Cuban law work? Because you see Cubans and there may be poverty and they may be despairing, and there's certainly la lucha in excess, but how are they kept in line, and how does that work?
Well, there's different mechanisms. I mean, I believe myself, there are a lot of police. It has one of the highest per capita ratios of police to population in the world. The prison about 1% of Cubans are police officers. The proportion of people in jail is also extremely high, matched only by the United States and South Africa, I believe. And you can be arrested for anything at any time. And then there is this sort of sub rosa aspect of power. I mean, of course, one thing, it's an island, so where are people going to go? You don't need a Berlin Wall or a machine gun. And the sub rosa aspect fascinates me because there are many very subtle ways of enforcing power, and ultimately behind all of them is the fist. There are, have always been, and are even just a couple of weeks ago, what are called acts of repudiation, where people who dissent or cause any form of trouble suddenly find a mob in front of their house, a mob of loyalists trucked in and led by plainclothes police officers, and everyone denounces them as Yankee spies and throws bricks at their house. There's eavesdropping, but generally, for every genuine secret agent listening in, there are 99 imaginary ones. That's one of the most effective tools. The mere possibility of surveillance creates an atmosphere of surveillance. And ultimately, everybody in Cuba knows where power lies. And I'll mention one of the breakthrough moments I had in Cuba. I think most of the true things I learned there, I learned at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was with a news reporter in Havana, and we were walking, getting back to our hotel, and we'd got turned around in Vedado neighborhood, and we started talking to a kid in the street. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, but Cubans are always sitting around doing nothing. And I said, well, how do we get from here? And so this kid, he wanted to walk with us and chat for a little bit. And the police jumped out and arrested him, put him in handcuffs, and led him away. And that is the second time I've had that happen to me in Cuba. They'd like to separate tourists from ordinary people who, who are trying to do things that aren't approved, black market stuff or whatever. And he was put in handcuffs and led away. And I had seen this once before, 10 years before, and I just couldn't stand it, to see it again. And I confronted the police officers and said, no, this is wrong, you can't do this. And they were very nice about it. They said, oh, sorry, we have to, and they're very nice. And they were leading the guy away, and we sort of followed them through the streets of Havana at, now 3:15 in the morning, and more police officers started coming. And pretty soon, the police car blocked off an alley, and we were stuck in this alley with 15 police officers, and me and my very nervous friend from Newsweek. And I just didn't, this sort of streak of stubbornness came out in me, and I refused to go away. They kept trying to tell me, get out of here, leave. And I actually left at one point, and then I came back, and I said, no, this is just not right. He wasn't doing anything. We were literally discussing the weather. Why are you arresting him? And the cops were very nice about it, but there's more and more of them, and it's because now it's 3:30, and now it's 3:45 in the morning. And finally, the sort of officer who was in charge gets on his radio and mutters a few words, and everyone gets very tense. And there was a long sort of wait. Not that long, sort of 5 minutes goes by, and nobody's talking, and suddenly everything's waiting. A lotta screeches up, and out gets this guy in his 20s, dressed entirely in white. White shirt, white pants, white socks, white shoes. Immaculate, clean white shoes. I'm like, what? He gets out of the car, looking like he owns Cuba. Out behind him gets this knockout woman, like a tall, beautiful gal in a tiny little white cocktail dress and white shoes. I'm like, what? Did I die? What is going on here? And the guy gets out of the car, and I've seen a couple of people like this, and I know the expression, and this is the face of power. Absolutely impassive, no expression, and he did not say a word. The police officer bent over the officer who was in charge. And this guy's like 27, right? And there's 15 cops in their dirty uniforms and badges and everything. Whispers in the guy's ear, rah, 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 rah. And the guy in white sort of looks at me, stares me up and down, and just goes, and gets back in the car and goes away, and the kid is released. Who was that guy? I don't know to this day, but Cubans know that guy. They know who he is, whoever he is. He comes from the authorities. He comes from the Ministry of the Interior, or he's from a family, or whoever he is, he's coming from where power is in Cuba. And there are those guys. I've seen them just a couple of times. It's a glimpse that you get of what is behind all the police and all the other measures. There is someone deciding your fate. And Cubans see that guy more often than we do.
Could I ask you a question, Patrick, while the audience thinks if they want to ask you any further ones? It's a state secret to talk about Fidel's health. The press and all the media is completely state-controlled. What then are Cubans thinking about health and the future? And what's the rumor mill like? Because everything in Cuba works on a rumor because there's no truth.
And the most accurate thing in Cuba is the rumor mill. Time and again, I find out it's true. What you hear in what they call radio bemba, which is lip radio, or the street gossip, or we'd say on the grapevine. And, you hear all sorts of things. One guy I know told me, Fidel, he's already dead. And we know about computers. We know about you people with your computers. You can manipulate the images and so on. But Radio Bemba says the same thing as the official dispatches, which say the same thing as all my sources, which is Fidel has suffered from a very routine gastrointestinal illness, probably diverticulitis, which is a pinching off of the intestines and infection. what I heard on Radio Bumble was that he refused to get a, what do you call it, a colostomy bag? The leader of the revolution cannot go around with a colostomy bag, and that this was a mistake, and that led to complications, and he had to have subsequent operations, and now he has a colostomy bag, supposedly. This is Radio Bemba. Nobody knows. But, on the other hand, you're talking to a guy who talked to a guy who talked to a guy named Gabriel Garcia Marquez. These New York Times editors had just had breakfast with Gabo, and Gabo says, oh, yeah, he's recovering. And, indeed, they had, supposedly gone for a walk together. So now you know everything I know. Is it true? I didn't see him, and you haven't got your press visa or interview yet. I suspect that it is true, that he is an old, weak man. I saw him probably 10 years ago, pretty close. I mean, as close as we are. And I was able to get in among the cameras in an event and spend like an hour this close to him. And 10 years ago, his hands were trembling violently. And he could not get up stairs like this without Felipe Perez Roca, the boy wonder of Cuban diplomacy, sort of, Fidel locked his arm like Franklin Roosevelt would and was sort of lifted up the stairs like that. So that was 10 years ago, and he's a robust guy. He keeps making recoveries and coming back, and I fully expect, next week he'll be rolled out and propped up to chants of vivas, but I don't think he's ever coming back for real. They've kind of acknowledged that, and they say, yes, he won't be in the same role as before, and Raul's titles were acting titles, now they're real titles. He's the actual president of Cuba now. He could be dead for all I know.
Any more questions?
Hi, James Maycock. I just wondered what you felt the effect of the black market was in Cuba on the Cuban youth, and particularly, did it have any effect on the propaganda in education? I mean, I know there are a lot of American films even shown in cinemas as well as existing in the black market.
Yeah, the black market, the Cubans I was saying before, they're very adaptable, and that's one of the ways they've adapted. At different points in the last 15 years, I've seen the black market get out of control. And when it does, they tend to adapt and co-opt it. And, the example of that was the currency. In the early 90s, they ended up with these crazy exchange rates, and I was changing money in dark alleys with people, 80 to 1 and stuff. So they made it legal to have the dollar and said, okay, 80 to 1, fine. And then suddenly the dollar stabilizes and goes to its real value, and then later they change the currency again. But they tend to adapt. If there's black markets in food, they say, okay, we'll have farmers markets and let people sell them for real until the black market disappears, and then they close the farmers markets. So they, in sort of goods and services like that, they're adaptable, and the black market tends to get reined in. The cultural impact of the black market, I'm not so sure of. I think I was talking to people, satellite television is a new phenomenon in Cuba, and recently, a couple months ago, they busted a clandestine factory for satellite dishes, and it's too late. There's already thousands in Cuba. But according to, the people I talk to there, nobody, what they're watching is action movies. What they want to see is, they don't watch the news, they don't watch documentaries or programs and stuff. They don't know what to make of the Cuban exiles. What they want is entertainment. In particular, what people are fascinated by is they get the channels from Miami and they want to see the advertising. That's what gets them really excited. Look at all these things. And they're dreaming about this sort of pent-up material needs. I'm sure it must have some effect, but generally what the movies you see in Cuba are the absolute worst 1970s C-grade action flicks, stuff that makes Chuck Norris look like an Oscar winner. It's just total crap. So it must be boring them to tears, I think, is the major U.S. impact.
Well, I went there a couple of months ago, and a Cuban was telling me that they could go to cinema and watch Gus Van Sant films, for example. So there were higher quality.
Yeah, it's true.
It was the cultural impact, really, of the kind of the American films coming in, and whether the idea that seeing those goods was going to heighten their desire for change, really.
Well, what did people tell you about that? Because I'm not sure I've seen that. People tell me the satellite television, what Cubans most focus on is the advertising. So maybe that is the impact, and it creates awareness. But I generally find Cubans don't have much awareness of what the outside world is like. A woman said to me last week, so is it true, America, it's just like Cuba? And of all the things you can think about America, it's not. That's just the one that surprised me most. So the sort of unrealistic, uninformed views of the outside world that come from propaganda seems to be still a dominant sort of mental state for Cubans. I don't myself see a big impact, you know.
Hi, Tamar Levi. I went to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea this summer, and a lot of the things you're talking about sound like, well, there are parallels, definitely. I'm wondering, when I was there, I felt like there was a movement towards a dialogue or an awareness or maybe a train station connecting the Trans-Siberian Railway to South Korea. And I'm wondering, do you think your knowledge of Cuba could inform us on what that dialogue might entail with North Korea in the future and what they might be experiencing or thinking, or not necessarily the North Koreans themselves, but the entire situation and the mentality towards an awareness of the outside?
I'll speculate in that I think the only thing that Cuba and North Korea would have in common is the atmosphere in the presidential headquarters. They say that Fidel lives in a bubble, that he's surrounded by constant evidence of how wonderfully everything is going, that there are endless triumphs. He's always shown in the newspaper in front of a, commanding the latest preparations for the U.S. invasion, and there's a map with bright lights on it, and he says, oh, you go over here, and he deploys these imaginary troops and sort of lives in this fantasy world in which the revolution is ever triumphant and expanding. He said on the radio with Hugo Chavez last week that all his theories have been proven true. Capitalism is on the point of collapse. And I don't myself know Korea, but I think there is a self-sustaining dynamic within a closed leadership that you see this. Czesław Milosz talked about the captive mind, and he was talking more about what ordinary Cubans or Eastern Europeans were feeling, and we talk about the cultural impact and movies and so on. I do think Cubans still live within that captive mind, unaware of outside issues or unable to judge them in perspective. But it's the leadership that is most blinded. It's the leadership that is most captive. The higher you rise in that system, prostitutes on the streets know the truth about Cuba. They go to wherever, they go everywhere. They see the hypocrisy, they're independent, they can think, they meet foreigners, they know what's going on. The higher you go in the hierarchy, the less realistic people are. So maybe you can tell me if that applies in North Korea. I think they are very closed off, and that that dynamic can only go in one direction, towards more exclusion and more demands and more. It's not a dynamic that encourages compromise or giving in on your fundamental principles or ideas. It doesn't have a lot of openings towards change. I hope that's true what you say about railroads through North Korea and so on. And if the United States, for example, lifted its trade embargo on Cuba, you could have measures like that and begin a process. But there's actually probably less dialogue going on with Cuba right now than between North and South Korea.
Hi, my name's Emily Marlowe. I, about 12 years ago, was at a United Nations conference, and Castro was there. The conference was on small island developing states around the world. I just wonder what the current situation is in terms of international dialogue, with the United Nations, with different bodies, in terms of Cuban politics.
There is a dialogue between Europe and Cuba, which, I believe is the correct example of how to handle Cuba. I wish the United States would pursue a sort of European policy of flooding the country with packaged tourists and then constantly kicking Cuba in the shins about human rights and democracy. There's been a sort of series of up and downs and sometimes bizarre incidents in the diplomacy between Britain and France and Germany and Cuba on the one hand. There was a few years ago in 2003, there was what the Cubans call the Black Spring, when there was a wave of arrests in Cuba. About 75 dissidents were arrested and many of them sentenced to 28 years in jail. And, the United States has nothing to say about these things. They shout up and down in Washington, but nobody's listening. But the Cubans are actually in an exchange with European countries and do listen and want so on and want some contact. And the European response was to condemn this and to withdraw ambassadors for a while. And Castro was outraged. He said, "Oh, this French, all they ever do is just what the Americans want." And then after about 6 months, that policy evaporated, and the ambassadors went back to Havana, and the dialogue was reopened. And Castro, I thought this was a little humiliating, but Castro actually dictated a specific promise, which major European ambassadors had to pledge, that they would never invite dissidents to cocktail parties again. Explicitly, and the Cubans trumpeted in the press this cocktail party ban. No more inviting these guys to your embassies, because it's, these are the enemies of Cuba, of course. And, in the end, I think the dialogue, it has its ups and downs. That's the nature of a dialogue. So it is much more effective than the United States policy of saying nothing and saying, yeah, well, you suck. Oh, yeah, well, you suck. That produces nothing. Perhaps over time, the European policy will bear fruit, and indeed Europeans, and the French in particular, become the hardest advocates for human rights in Cuba, which just infuriates the Cubans who look for allies in Europe. It's an incomplete project.
Just to say, from a British point of view, there's no doubt that the Blair government has decreased contacts with Cuba. There's been a massive change from when the Conservatives were in, perhaps slightly counterintuitive, this. And also to say that the role of the former Spanish Prime Minister Aznar was very fundamental in hardening the line towards Cuba. And
He's a hero to the dissidents. His photo you find in their houses all the time.
With the arrival of Zapatero now in Spain, that has changed. So a lot of that has actually been, if you like, internal politics in the EU. But certainly British contacts within Cuba are decreased, and we're doing less. I'm not quite sure why. Blair was very closely aligned to Aznar for obvious reasons to do with Iraq, found Aznar a partner within the EU, and probably there has been a real problem, I think, with UK foreign policy towards Latin America. Very little contact, and in a way a kind of following of, at times, a US, or I would suggest in this case, a Spanish-led ideology, which has been unhelpful. It would be difficult to perceive a independent British foreign policy towards Latin America.
It's very curious with Cuba. Everything becomes inverted. Progressives become reactionary, and reactionaries become progressives. It depends on, and the French become right now the bête noire of the Cuban government, who were their greatest friends for so long and very romantic in their image as a French and like a disillusioned lover, have sort of woken up and suddenly discovered that they were not getting what they thought they were getting, And George Bush, of course, becomes the president who does several $1 billion worth of trade deals with Cuba, all the while announcing we're just going to strangle him.
I'm afraid we've got to finish. I would like to thank Patrick very much. I also would like to say that when this book first arrived, I thought, oh, not another book on Fidel Castro. I have to say it's beautifully written and very different, and I would highly recommend it. And it's good for old-timers like myself, but it's also good for people who perhaps haven't been to Cuba, don't know much about Cuba, as it's a gentle entry point into both the history of Cuba and its contemporary situation. And I believe the books here are on sale at a special discounted price. So get them while you can. I think they're I've been signalling £5 for a book. But Patrick, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rosalind.